Hi, everyone. My name is Shelley Diaz, and I'm the reviews editor at School Library Journal. Welcome to our webcast on the editorial process, the reviews editorial process. We're super excited to talk to all of you today about what we do, give you a sneak peek of the SLJ reviewer process. And I just wanted to let you know the impetus for this webcast. Increasingly, I've been receiving emails from librarians such as yourselves about the clarification on the SLJ review process. These requests often come at the heels of a challenge or whether it's the school district or a parent or the fear of being challenged. So we wanted to give you a sneak peek at the process and, talk about how we come up with grade levels, how we come up with stars. And so I hope that this will be a useful tool to protect the rights of your students and their shelves and their right to read. And we have a great group of speakers today. So I'm going to ask if everyone could just say their names and talk about their connection to SLJ reviews.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Shelley. My name is Kiera Parrott, and I am currently the director of Darien Library in Connecticut. But prior to that, I was the reviews director at SLJ and LJ. So very excited to be here with some former colleagues and friends of mine today.
I'll go next, I guess. I'm Mahnaz. I am a reference and professional reading editor at School Library Journal, and I also handle graphic novels, and I also do some editing also for our sister publication, Library Journal.
Hi, I'm Ashley Leffel, and I am a reviewer for SLJ. I am at a middle school campus in Frisco, Texas. Middle school in my district is 6th through 8th. And I do a little bit of reviewing of everything, young adult, graphic novels, middle grade.
Awesome. And so, as I mentioned, we all have a connection to SLJ reviews. We're excited to have Ashley here. She might, she can definitely offer insight into not only the review process, but also, as a middle school librarian, the difference between YA and younger YA and older YA. So I'm glad that Ashley is with us today. Just so you know who are SLJ reviewers, they're essentially your colleagues. They are all practicing or retired school librarians and librarians who work with children. Some of them are academics in children's literature, but for the most part, they're all your colleagues. And we pride ourselves in that because obviously they're other wonderful reviews journals, but we are specifically for school librarians and librarians who work with children. And your colleagues know what you're looking for when it comes to a review. And how do you become one? So we have an application process. We can definitely share that link with you later on. And it's pretty simple, right, Ashley? What do you think?
It's very simple. So I've been reviewing for SLJ since 2016, and I've been a librarian for a couple of years, and I had noticed some other people that I knew were reviewing for SLJ. So I found the application on the website. You also submit 2 writing samples in the SLJ style, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit later. And from there, I was very fortunate. I got a letter back saying, "We'd love for you to review."
Yeah. And, we love you to review for us, Ashley, as well. And so when that application comes in, I'm the one that takes a look at it. I look at people's expertise. I look at their experience as librarians. I look at the reviews that they submit to see if there's a nice balance of the evaluation and plot. And you don't have to have a degree or an MFA. Most of all, we value your assessment as a school librarian, as a public librarian. So that's what we look for. And we're editors, right? That's why we're here. Our job is to help you shape the review and get it to where it should be. So you don't have to be, a super strong writer, but we do want to have like that nugget there. And we want to see that. And so I thought maybe we could, start off the webcast. Actually, a librarian submitted a question ahead of time, and I think it covers a lot of what we want to talk about today. So I'm going to read that question. She says, I wondered if reviewing for SLJ is something you can do part-time with your other work, perhaps leading to a full-time position or perhaps not. Are reviewers generally people in other related professions such as librarians or direct employees of SLJ? Thank you for your time. Looking forward to this webinar. So we kind of answered already some of the aspects of that question. This is all volunteer reviewing. We, out of some of the staff, we are librarians ourselves. I'm a librarian, Mahnaz is a librarian, Kiera is a librarian. So essentially you can start as a reviewer, and some of our reviewers have become editors. So it's not impossible to go from reviewer to as part of the full-time SLJ staff. And as we said, reviewers are librarians, and I think that's the first part of the question.
And if I could add,
yeah, sure.
What I kind of think of as payment for it is you do get a byline on your reviews. And so I remember the excitement, my first review, when I went to Barnes and Noble's website and there's my review. So that's kind of a fun little thing that goes along with reviewing.
Yeah. And then we also have discount codes when it comes to webcasts, and we try our best. It was easier when we were in the office, but we try our best to eventually send you a finished book of the book that you reviewed, or a finished book in general. So there are small ways that even though you're a volunteer reviewer, we try our best to kind of help you in one way or another. So the next question really gets at the meat of this webcast, and I'm going to ask if, and this is from, again, the reviewer, the librarian who submitted it. So I'm going to ask Kiera Mahnaz to tackle it first. And then after we do that, we can continue with the questions that we prepared ahead of time. So this question from a librarian goes as follows. This question is from a middle school colleague. I work in a 4th to 6th grade upper elementary school. Are there rubrics or guidelines for determining the middle grade or YA designation, or is that done on the publishing side? She feels that reviews are not mentioning sexual content and language for middle grade books, things that she would like to be aware of when building her middle grade collection. I would also be interested in this because I have to determine whether middle grade books will be acceptable for a 4th to 6th grade demographic. Are the guidelines for discussing controversial content specifics in reviews, such as the frequency or depth of sexual content and/or language? We tend to seek out layperson reviews like Amazon or Goodreads to get answers to some of those questions, because they aren't always addressed in professional reviews. So I know that was a long question, but Kiera and Mahnaz, do you want to tackle that first?
Sure. So, I feel like when it comes to any sort of grade level, grade range determination, particularly the middle school versus YA, but really any of that, it's really a little more art than science, is how I would describe it. There's not, at least when I was at SLJ, and it's probably similar now, there's not like a checklist, right? Or a tally, you're not like counting the number of swear words or anything like that. But I would always take pains to tell reviewers, do not rely on what the publisher puts on the back of the book or the flap, because now, not to disparage our very hardworking, very intelligent publishing colleagues who work very hard, but it's important that librarians recognize that the publishers and specifically the marketing departments, they have their job to do, right? And their job is to sell this book to the widest potential audience as possible, and that's not necessarily the audience that we, like professional librarians working on the ground, working with children and teens, would actually recommend this for. They might say it's fine for grades 4 through 8. And maybe it is, but chances are it's probably a slightly more narrow range based on some of the things that the librarian was mentioning. So, I think when to mention content, mature content, is a delicate, sort of sensitive negotiation, because on the one hand, we want to alert the buyer, the librarian, what is in this book? Does it have a bunch of F-bombs in it? Does it have a lot of sex scenes in it, or graphically depicted violence? You know, that's information that's important for the librarian to know, where, if she wants to or they want to purchase it, and where in the collection to put it. But I know, and Mahnaz might want to speak a little bit more to this, but you know, what some people would consider controversial content is just facts. So the example I would often give when I was working with reviewer is the difference between sexual content, meaning sex on the page, you know, description of, you know, actual sexual acts. That is what I would consider mature content, right? It would get a PG-13 or an R rating if it was in a movie, right? That's important information, versus someone's identity. And, you know, like if it's a book about an LGBTQ character, and it is stated that they, you know, are, let's say, bisexual, that's not necessarily on its own sexual content. That's just identity, right? That's a factor of that person. And you may or may not want to mention that in the review if it's relevant. So we would often, you know, talk about what is mature content, and where is that line, and what needs to be stated, and what is just, you know, a major or a minor fact of the book. So that's, you know, a little gray area there, but Mahnaz, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I thought you put it really beautifully. And I think it also becomes complicated because the reviews have to do so much, and they have a very short word count. You know, they're 250 absolute max, and you know, they're having to provide some plot. They're also having to provide some analysis, and, you know, give somebody a sense of what it feels like to read this book in the space of, you know, 250 words. And then I think it can become a little hard to also try to alert someone to every instance that might be mature content. And I think, like you say, Kiera, it is an art. I think that you sort of have to, I think, sometimes play it by ear. If it's a book for very young kids and it mentions it's about a death, I think that's worth noting. Also, I feel like that's part of the plot. You know, if it's a book about like death, like, and you don't mention it, you kind of like, well, did you really review the book, you know? And then I think as you get a little bit older into YA, like if someone dies in a YA novel, but it's a minor character or something, I don't feel like, well, you didn't mention it, you didn't warn someone, you've not done your job. So I do think that there is a lot of like gray area. And I think with reviewing, you know, as you said, it's an art, not a science. And I think you could probably debate for like, you know, hours on the merits. And you could even like, you know, 10 people could review a book that we all love, and we could all agree that we all love this book, and we could all say different things about it. And I think on some level it really is so subjective. Like I think of some of the stuff that I read when I was a kid, and I never gave it a second thought, but now like as an adult doing editing, doing reviewing, I think about that in such a different way. And I think also when I'm editing or writing, I try to be as value neutral when describing something like that. So like if there is nudity in, say, a graphic novel, because I edit a lot of graphic novel reviews, I try to couch it in terms of, you know, there is full frontal nudity in this book, like in such and such scene, and to give them some context, so that they can know, like, okay, is it like a sex scene? Is it someone just, you know, in a locker room, and it's a kid describing, you know, what it's like to be in the locker room, and try to kind of stay away from things like viewers might be alarmed by. Just try to make it as, you know, as neutral as we can, because I also feel like, you know, we're not common sense media at SLJ. We are in the business of reviewing, and I think fundamentally what we're about is the literary quality, in addition to the other stuff too. So
Great, thanks Mahnaz and Kiera. And Ashley, I'm really interested to hear what you have to say about grade levels, because you make those suggestions all the time when it comes to YA and middle school. You're a middle school librarian, so what do you think?
I completely agree with it being an art. I really like the analogy of the PG-13 R-rated movies. So if you're reading a book and you can tell that something sexual is about to happen, but it kind of fades to black and they move on, then, you know, okay, we could kind of put that in 8th grade, it's going to be all right. But if you have a book and they're explicitly describing things, then it's kind of, oh, we need to put this in high school. And also with high school and young adult, it's kind of interesting. You can also have young adult that's almost new adult. So I mean, even I've written reviews where I've said it's 10th or 11th or even 12th grade and up, because it's just that has that much content in it. Middle grade is really difficult because you're really going from, third or fourth grade all the way up to 8th grade. And what I try to do in my reviews is, if it's something that is happening consistently that I feel like would help a librarian or a purchaser make that decision, I put it in there. So if it's something where there's excessive drug use by teenagers and minors, or if it deals with rape or sexual assault, you have to think about how it's being portrayed. Again, if it's off camera and they allude to it, or if it's something that's very graphic. It's dealing with gender identity. I think it's really important what Mahnaz was saying, and Kiera, that I like to include whether that's the theme of the book or if it's just something that the character is. So, I mean, you can have a character who's bisexual, but it's not a coming out book. And sometimes it's important to note that, because you may have a deficit in your collection and you're trying to build up your LGBTQ, and that's something that you need to know. So it's, like they said, it's an art. And I think the more you do it, I wouldn't say it necessarily gets easier, but you start to kind of notice trends. Like, for example, you may have a romance that's very clean, but the people in the book are college students. So, I mean, a 6th grader isn't, even if, there's no bad language, they're just kissing, they're not going to relate. So you have to, there's so many different facets that you're thinking about. It's kind of a fun puzzle to put together.
Thanks, Ashley. I think that's super helpful. And just to give you a few some kind of brass tacks information, all of our reviewers receive a huge packet, right, as part of their training to review for us. And the understanding is that they're going to read through all of that, and it has that we have a document that Kiera created talking about, like, how do you put a grade level, right? And I'm just going to read from it really quickly. So let's see. Grade ranges can go from preschool to grades 10 and up, and kind of referring back to what Ashley said, if a book is higher than grades 10 and up, at that point, we really have to make a decision. Do we want to review it? Should we put it in our adult books for teens section? Because at that point, a librarian would be purchasing only for their 11th graders and 12th graders. So is it worth that money for your tiny, tiny budget? You can indicate as wide or narrow range for a title as you deem appropriate. We do not suggest you use the publisher recommendation. Again, reiterating what Kiera said, we prefer your own opinion. Please consider various factors when determining a grade level. This includes the age of the protagonist, the plot itself, and level of complexity, as well as content and language. So, like Ashley said, it's such a range of things when we consider the grade level. And for younger readers, this might be appropriate for a preschooler or a kindergartner if it's a read aloud, right? But maybe compared to a child's reading level, it might be slightly different. So there are lots of things that we take into account, and art, not a science, as we've talked about already. So I'm going to move on to the next question, and that is, how do we decide what gets a star? So Mahnaz, why don't you start us off?
Sure, yeah. So we start, I think, when a review comes in, you have the option to click a little icon with a star next to it, and that means that if you read the book and you thought like it was really amazing and you think that it merits a star, and from there, it's ultimately an editorial decision, but we do take that into account really strongly. So if I'm editing a review and I see that the reviewer wants to star it, I'm going to take a look. I mean, I look at everything as I'm reviewing, but I'm going to take a special look at it and really like kind of ask myself, is it a star? And I'm also, we'll also, if a review is glowing, we're going to take a look anyway, because it seems like, well, the reviewer didn't say star, but it seems like the review doesn't work without a star. They're saying it's an essential purchase. It's the best book, on this subject since whatever. Like that's kind of like, certain like phrases will sort of trigger yeah, let's look a little bit more closely. And sometimes even if it's a book that other people have been telling me it's getting buzz, or it's a huge author, like somebody who won the Newbery last year, like after Jerry Craft did New Kid, like of course I'm going to look at Class Act to see if it's a star. It doesn't mean he's going to get a star automatically, but like I'm paying, kind of close attention because I know that first book and I want to kind of, give it kind of a look. And sometimes, it might just even be a book kind of fills a niche. Like I was reading a couple of graphic novels last week and they were kind of on the younger end. And I was thinking, I often think like I don't get a ton of those, when it comes to making the best books list. So I'll tend to look a little bit more closely at those books. And in terms of, I guess, after you look closely, like what makes a book a star, I think that's, like Kiera said, it's almost indefinable. I feel like it's almost like, how do you know? You sort of just know on some level. I think some things that help are, you sort of ask yourself if it's an illustrated book, are the text and the art working together in a sort of beautiful harmony? If it's a picture book, like, or a graphic novel, do they play off each other? If we're looking at nonfiction, we're looking at things like, accuracy, obviously. Also, is it doing something that no other book has done before? Like if it's a founding fathers biography, we've had a lot of those, but is it doing something completely, mind-blowing? And I think that's something else too, like when you've been doing this for a while, you see what other people have done and you kind of know, if something is great, but it's similar to what's come before it, that can be an issue. But if like this is the first book on a topic, sometimes it might not be perfect, but it's filling a really important need. You might start for that reason. And I think also sometimes it does help to take into consideration how much attention the book is going to get. Like if it's a book from a huge author and it's great, but it has these flaws, you might say to yourself, well, it's probably going to do pretty okay in the world. Like, librarians will know to buy it, bookstores will stock it, versus maybe a debut author from a smaller press where, maybe the book isn't perfect, but, we love it and we really do want to make sure that librarians see it. So I think that's often a huge consideration, so you're thinking about the literary quality, but you're also thinking about what it means to have a star. And I think that so many, like when libraries don't always have like huge budgets, they're often going to the stars as like their go-to for purchasing. So I think, keeping that in mind is really like paramount for me, this idea that, giving a book a star is it's like giving it, sort of the ultimate seal of approval. So wanting to make sure that we're helping books get out there into the world and to get noticed, I think is really crucial.
Well put, Mahnaz. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, it's not just a cut and dry rote thing. It is a little bit more of like, I know it when I see it, which is a tough one. But, I think if you've ever served on like an awards committee or even done a mock committee, the types of critical evaluation and the sort of criteria that you're keeping in the back of your mind as you're evaluating those works are similar. I mean, it's not getting an award, so it's not as heavy necessarily as like a Newbery or even a mock Newbery, but I remember when I first started at SLJ, I was like, I needed some criteria to just guide because it is so amorphous. And we kind of use the Ask Notables loosely. And if you're not familiar, the Ask Notables criteria are, what you would expect: literary quality, originality, what Mahnaz was talking about in terms of the illustration and the excellence of the illustration, and how if it's a picture book or graphic novel, that type of work, how they're communicating and sort of playing off one another. And appeal. I mean, appeal is actually a really big part of it. There are some books that as adults, we are like, it is gorgeous, it's moving, it's poignant, the language is incredible. But who's going to read this? Is a child or even a teenager actually going to pick this up and enjoy it? And that can be the death knell for, it could be a book that we all agree is great, but we're like, I can't imagine a young reader appreciating this, and that might knock it down off of consideration. So all of those things kind of play into the discussions. And just a quick note on process. I don't know if this is still happening because things, I've been gone now a year and a half and COVID has sort of disrupted everything. But when I was there, and maybe it's still, these were a lot of discussions. It wasn't like a one editor decision. Oh, good. I see Shelley nodding her head. So this is where, when you have a process that is a little bit more art than science, and it is so subjective, having second, third, fourth opinions can be really helpful. So you've got the reviewer often as the initial opinion, recommending that star or giving it a super glowing review. And then you, the person who's edited the review and probably read most, if not all of the book at that point. And then you can ask your colleagues, what do you think? Take a look, or, and having that feedback back and forth, at least one or two meetings. And it's not like a strict, at least it wasn't when I was there, like a strict vote, but we're trying to get consensus, among the editorial team. Do we feel, most of us feel that this is deserving of a star or not? And so you're not kind of out on a limb with some of these decisions. You have that group support, which is helpful.
What about you, Ashley? I'm interested to hear, like, when you receive a book, what do you think about when you are nominating it for a star?
Well, when I first started reviewing, I was more likely to give stars. It's just the excitement of, oh, that's a really good book, star. And I was like, I keep recommending these stars and they're not giving them. And I look back now and I'm like, what was I thinking? But as I've had the chance to review, just like I think Mahnaz was saying, that if a book is by a very well-known author, immediately before I read that, I'm thinking, okay, is this going to be another thing that's going to be really popular? The biggest thing I think about when I'm going to star a title is I don't look at it as librarian. I look at it, if it's a middle grade, I'm a 7th grader, I'm coming into the library, am I going to want that book? I also, if I'm thinking about it as a librarian, how am I going to sell this book? Because like Kiera said, there are some books that are incredibly well written that I love, that I would give to my students and they would be like, Mrs. Leffel, what are you thinking? This is not it. And on the same end, I have books that I've reviewed that are not my favorite, but I think they deserve a star because I can see the kids are going to like it. Another thing, when it's not a well-known author, if it's a really good book and that star is going to give it that boost and get it into the hands of readers, that's something really to consider. But it's kind of, for me, it's when like there's just something about that book, whether it's a little different than anything you've read before, or you can just see the mass appeal of it, because ultimately we want to get the right books for readers in their hands. And if that star can help that book get distributed more, then that's what we want to do.
Oh, and to add one more thing, I think also what everyone is saying, the idea of collaboration helps, because I do try to read with that mindset, actually, pretending that I'm, channeling my inner Mahnaz, little Mahnaz. But then sometimes I'll be reading a book and I know it's not my genre, like I'm not the strongest sci-fi reader. And I think that's where it often helps to ask a colleague, and you might say, like, everyone else is loving this, but I'm not quite feeling it. Is it just me, And I think that kind of helps. I think that's one of the hardest things too, because we all come into it with like a love of reading, and you sort of have to remind yourself it's not always about like what you love. It's what readers of that genre maybe, or that age level or whatnot, are gonna love. So sometimes you do have to turn off like your own personal, not turn off your personal feelings, but kind of learn to broaden them, or learn to say, you know what, like it's not totally about like my passion or lack of passion.
And
Right,
kind
right.
of going,
Sorry. Go ahead, Ashley.
Going in the opposite direction. If I ever have a book that I read and I really feel strongly like this is not that great, it's not, I don't know why it was written. Usually if that happens, I will put the book away and just sit on it for a day or two. going back to the question from the middle school librarian, I do go on, I'll write my review, and before I'd submit it, I'll go on to Amazon or Goodreads and just kind of get a feel to see, is this my personal bias? I'm just not into that sci-fi book, or, oh, people are saying the same thing. There are plot holes, it's choppy, things like that. So, I mean, there's lots of different levels of community. And then knowing that the editors are going to take a look at it too, that really kind of helps everything.
Yeah, and I want to add two things. Hopefully I'll remember both of them. So what Mahnaz said about remembering that this is not a book from Mahnaz, right? And I think as librarians, that's what, when we're purchasing books, we have to understand this is not Shelley's bookshelf. This is not Shelley's library. This is, remember who your audience is. And for us, we've probably read at this point as adults, hundreds of historical fiction romances. But think about the fact, like, this middle schooler, this is going to be the first time they're going to read this genre, right? And so we might read something like, oh my God, been there, done that, but we were thinking, like, if you are a middle schooler and you read this, is your mind going to be blown, right? And those are some of the things that when we're reading stars, like, those are some of the things that we think about. And when it comes to diversity, especially, okay, fine, a rom-com that you've seen, like, what is it, Enemies to Lovers? I love that rom-com trope. But have you ever seen a person of color in these type of stories? Have you ever seen an ace person in this type of story? Like, if that's the only one that you have read in this genre, like, okay, it's a trope that we've seen over and over again. But this is a story that we have not seen over and over again. So these are some of the questions that we think about. What was the other thing? I forgot. Sorry, if it comes back to me, I'll jump in at some point. Oh, I remember. So again, going back to how we begin with the reviewer. We begin the review. There's a little box, the reviewer clicks star. And so sometimes we have a notes field where reviewers can talk about, like, extensively, this is a star because this and this and this, or this book sucks because this and this and this, right? And so at the end of the day, when we're trying to decide and multiple editors have read it, we always go back to that initial reviewer and say, well, Ashley Leffel, I trust her opinion. She's amazing. And if she thinks this is a star, let's make it a star. So yeah, those are the two things I wanted to add. So moving on, because we can talk about this all day. So let's see what the next question is. Here we go. Okay, so how do you craft a review? What are some of the things that you want to make sure are part of the review? So let's see, Ashley, can you start, since you craft reviews all the time?
Absolutely. So when I craft my reviews, the very first thing that I do is the verdict. I feel like as a busy professional, if you're trying to buy books and you have a deadline, they're going to go straight to that verdict first to see if it's worth finding any more information about it. So usually I start there, and then from there, I kind of jump around. I'll start writing a little bit about the plot, and I'll be like, oh, that plot point, I need to point out that, hey, there's excessive drug use here. And it kind of builds on each other. But for me, I feel like the verdict is that one little piece that has to be there, it's really, like we've been saying, an art, because you have to fit so much in that little sentence. Because for some people, if you put, that's a secondary choice, or this a must have for collections, that's going to determine how they spend their money. So I try to include genre in there. Again, I've even written, again, going back to that middle grade question, sometimes a book will have like a lot of sexual content and drug use. And, you know, me thinking of it as a mom, I want there to be consequences, but in this book, there are no consequences. So sometimes I'll put that in the book. I'll be like, you know, all these things are happening in this book. Just, you know, it's like real life. Sometimes things work out well, sometimes things don't. So again, it's an art. I can't stress that enough, but the more you do it, you start to think about certain things that you know you need to be in there. But the verdict is really, that's the key.
I think that's a really great way to start. I don't know if I'm quite as orderly as you, but I often tend to make a lot of lists when I'm writing. Sometimes I'll just kind of start by throwing in phrases of things that I want to say. You know, is the mood, you know, gripping and suspenseful? Which parts of the plot do I feel are really important? Like if it's, you know, a divorced, usually blended family, that kind of is a big part of it, I'll throw that in there. And then I'll kind of find myself like fitting it in almost like a jigsaw puzzle at some point, moving things around a little bit. I think one thing that we like to try to tell reviewers is that, or I know that you've said this, Kiera, you know, try to make the review at least half plot and half evaluation. I mean, it doesn't have to be like, we're not going to be checking like, oh, it's 55%, you know, plot, that's bad. But I think just the basic idea that you want to be giving people a sense of what happens in the book, but also, you know, well, was that effective? Was that good? Is it well organized? Is it interesting? You know, like a sense of how well did the author actually pull this off? I think that sounds really obvious, but I think that that can be really tricky. And sometimes you do read reviews where you finish it and you don't quite know what the reviewer thought of it. And sometimes that there might be a reason that they don't put that in there. Maybe they haven't articulated it yet. Maybe they don't feel comfortable saying, you know, like it's not a good book. But I think that's really key. And also I think it's, since, you know, people aren't able to read every book before they purchase, you know, giving them a sense of what it feels like to read the book is good. So like, I think like words that indicate, you know, tone are really good. Like, does it feel, is it, you know, a book that you can't put down versus, you know, kind of a little bit drier and more academic. Just trying to make also every phrase count, I think helps. I remember when I was in library school, one of my professors, Caroline Ward, would, you know, she told us a little bit about reviewing, and she would say things like, you know, be as specific as possible, you know, like not just saying that it's beautiful art, but is it maybe, you know, Jackson Pollock-esque? Is it more impressionistic? You know, just trying to use every word in the review to give someone at a glance kind of a sense of that book.
Kiera, do you want to add anything about that?
The only thing I would add is, I know for folks who've not written reviews before, at least professionally, one thing we developed as part of that packet that Shelley was describing for new reviewers was kind of a primer on like your basic review. And the idea is, here's like a review kind of articulated out, like we actually call it the anatomy of an SLJ review. And the idea is, you know, for beginners, like here's what you can do. You can follow this formula. It doesn't mean you have to follow this formula forever. You know, it's like jazz, like you can play upon this as you get more comfortable and get more confident with your reviewing. But it literally had like, you know, your intro statement, which we used to call the nugget. It was like, you know, that almost like a topic sentence, like the first sentence of your review, kind of introducing something, you know, relevant and giving the reader a flair of what is this about, followed by, you know, at the very least, some summary of what the book's about, a little bit of plot, some analysis. It should be, you know, if you're starting out, aim for like a 50-50 at least. So it's not just all plot summary. And then the verdict, which I know we're going to talk about in a minute. And then, you know, we sort of had this breakdown to help newer reviewers. And I, you know, when I'm, you know, was writing reviews, I would sometimes go back to that anatomy because sometimes it was helpful to just like remind myself, oh, right. Especially when you're starting out.
Oh, and one more thing, I think that's a helpful resource to reviewers. I remember in library school reading K.T. Horning's From Cover to Cover, and I think that's a really useful book if you haven't started, because you know, K.T. Horning just makes it seem so accessible. And I think it's hard to talk about. Like, it's one of those things where it's like, how do you define a good review? Well, you know it when you see it, but she just, really pulls it apart in a really beautiful way.
Yeah, and thank you everybody. And two like brass tacks again, things that I want to share is that we do both negative and positive reviews, right? Some of the other review publications out there don't, but we think that negative reviews are just as valuable as positive reviews, because when I was purchasing for NYPL and BPL, New York Public Library and Brooklyn Public Library, one of the things that I think about, okay, this is a so-so review, but I don't have this in my collection. And if this so-so review wasn't in School Library Journal, then how would I know that this book is available, right? So, so those are the things that I think about. And of course, I was going to say something else. Oh, well, I just wanted to comment on the fact that I think it's fascinating, actually, that you start with the verdict. When I write reviews, that's kind of like the last thing I think about, but it makes so much sense because as a busy librarian, and as Kiera said, we start with that nugget. We don't have time often to read anything but the first sentence and the last sentence. So it is, I love that.
And as I'm writing my reviews, sometimes the verdict changes. Like I'll start out really, really just positive about it. And then I'm, doing my plot summary and I'm like, oh, wait, that didn't quite make sense. And, it changes. But I'm just like with working with my colleagues, we've all talked about, well, I read that verdict and it was on a mystery and I need mysteries in the collection and it was so reviewed. I'm going to give it a try.
Right. And, as we mentioned before, you want to have a diverse collection as possible. And okay, maybe this is not the best book, but if it's the only one that you've read in a while that features someone who is disabled, then you're going to want it in your collection, right? Because you want a diverse collection as possible. And something else that I wanted to share is that, more and more as you get more experience writing reviews, we want to try to push or guide our reviewers to do as little plot summary as possible, because you can go to Google, Goodreads, you can go to the publisher copy, you can go to Amazon and read plot summary everywhere. But in those 250 words, like what can I tell our readers that they're not going to get from Amazon, that they're not going to get from Goodreads? My librarian perspective, what can I share with my reviewers? My readers. So I do want to make sure we get to, do we have any audience questions? We do. We have like 24 audience questions. So the last thing we were going to talk about was verdicts, but I feel like we've covered it somewhat. Okay, so why don't we see if we can we can read some of the questions. Okay, let's see. Here's a question from Jennifer Ashby. Based on your explanation of a description of sex being mature, does that automatically warrant a specific grade level as a starting point?
I can speak to
Sure.
Just the way I review. If it is off camera, then I will consider it for 8 and under. 6 would be like the absolute lowest. And again, you have to think about, they allude to it, but a 6th grader would not realize what was happening. Again, you have to put yourself in that mindset, like, oh yay, they kissed, and then the next chapter starts and they're walking through the woods. If it's explicit, then definitely it's going to be for that 9th grade and up. So I'm not necessarily saying that there's a certain rubric that I go by, but if it does have something graphic, then I'm not even going to consider that as a middle grade. Same for language. If it's consistent throughout, then I'm more likely to put that in high school than in middle. Whereas, if it has 1 or 2 F-bombs and it actually was used because it was it went with the plot, it wasn't just the author using it just to use it, then I'm more likely to be like, okay, upper middle might be able to handle that.
Awesome. Thank you, Ashley. So one question from Casey Maynard, I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. How many reviewers does SLJ have? On average, how many reviews are each assigned in a calendar year? Thank you. So it varies. Pre-pandemic, we had almost 800, maybe a little bit over that, reviewers. Post-pandemic or during this pandemic, we've been definitely going low on the numbers, and understandably so, because so many of us are going through difficult times during this pandemic, and we understand that reviewing something voluntarily is not high on people's priority lists, right? If someone's sick in your family or you're under a lot of stress at work, whatever it may be, and we completely understand that. Or if someone's on a Newberry committee or any other committee, or if someone is about to give birth, like those are some of the things that we think about. And, we put that reviewer on hiatus and wait until you get back to us. Because as I said, we know that reviewing voluntarily is probably not high on your priority list. And we appreciate our reviewers who review despite, whatever else is going on in your life. Let's see, let's keep going.
And just
sure.
to add one little thing to that.
Yeah.
You can always email your editor and be like, hey, I haven't got a book in 3 months. I've got some time. I've gone where I've done one book every other month. Right now, I have 3 books with 3 different month deadlines. But again, my editor asked me, hey, I have these 3 books. Do you want to pick one? Do you want all of them? So, I mean, they're very, very flexible with working with you.
Yeah, thanks so much for jumping in with that. I completely forgot about that part of the question. And it also depends on what type of reviewer you are. If you're a picture books reviewer, some picture book reviewers like 3 books an assignment, right? Others want every other month, others want 1 a month. So it really depends on your preference. And as we get to know reviewers and reviewers feel more comfortable communicating with us, they let us know. And we appreciate any communication that you can have as a reviewer. Someone is asking, Mrs. S is asking, how long does it take to train in order to become a reviewer? So in that initial, yay, congratulations, you are part of the SLJ Reviews team. We assign right away, and that first and second review is almost like your probation type review, like when you start a new job, you have those first 3 months and you have your review after the first 3 months. It's sort of like that. And we can see where you need more help, where you need more guidance, maybe some of the things that you're missing. And we kind of like probe you on like, hey, what about this? What do you think about that? So, or we might, work with you even more closely. We might give you some examples that you can use as guidance. So yeah, those, and we do every now and then have reviewer trainings. Because of the pandemic, it's been definitely a lot more difficult to schedule those, but we hope to do that more in 2022, where we kind of pick a topic, how to review an illustrated work, right? Like what are some of the words and things I should be looking out for? So yeah, so training is it's always right. It doesn't just start at that beginning part. And so yeah, I hope that answers your question. I'm trying to get to as many as possible before our 10 minutes are up. Question from Emily Drew. Hi, Emily. I used to work with you. Is there an option to publish a review anonymously, or are names and affiliations required? This is an amazing question, because this is something that we've been talking about for the last few months, because we know, as we mentioned at the beginning of this webcast, that many librarians are coming against lots of critiques and lots of pressure. And so recently we decided to take away affiliation so that people don't have access to someone's school or someone's library information, because unfortunately librarians have had threats. I'm not saying that we have had, but we've heard about it. So we want to make sure that our librarians are protected because again, they're volunteer reviewers. And we're talking more about anonymous reviews. We're not quite there yet. Some of our fellow review journals are anonymous, some only have the name. So we're still having conversations about that. Anyone else want to jump in?
This has absolutely nothing to do with what we were just talking about, but it just popped into my head, and this is something important. When you become a reviewer, they do ask you what your reading interests are. So when I first started, I did middle grade and fantasy and sci-fi, and after a while of doing that, I was like, I want something different. So right now I'm doing a lot of young adult, LGBTQ, and being Black, it's sometimes I'll get titles where it's not a sensitivity reader position, but it helps to have somebody reading for that demographic. So I put that down as my interest as well. But the nice thing is you can change that at any time. I mean, if you've been reading historical fiction for months and you want to change it up a little bit, and you can also change how frequently they're sending you books. So sometimes in the summer, I'll be like, I have nothing to do but read, and they'll send me 2 books a month. So.
Right. And we so appreciate that, Ashley, when you do that. So, okay, we got 8 minutes. So someone's asking a really great question. Anne-Marie Kolakowski. I've been tracking author diversity for my purchases, and I noticed overall white authors still dominate Kidlit and tend to get the most stars too. Is this just because of the publishing industry? Do you consider diversity? So I'm going to ask Kiera, if you can start, and then maybe Mahnaz.
Sure. So I think you are probably right there in that, white authors and illustrators and creators, although there's been some great progress and we're seeing more diversification across the industry, there's still a long way to go. And I think part of that is, what's being published, and it's still predominantly from white creators about white protagonists and subject matter. And it can feel, for somebody, sort of taking a cursory look, it can feel like, oh, well, the awards are getting so much more diverse. And, if you take a surface level view, it can feel way more diverse than it actually is. So I love that you're actually collecting some deeper data on this, because it's not always what the headlines or just what the awards are doing that's reflective of the overall publishing industry. So I think part of it is that, and I think there's still a lot of implicit bias throughout the industry among all of the great gatekeepers, including us librarians and editors. And as much as we try, there are definitely certain authors and illustrators who are beloved people, and they tend to be surfaced more quickly because we know them, we're familiar, whatever, and some of that implicit bias comes into play in that. But I think absolutely, is diversity something that the editors consider? Yes, and I think that we have to. It's something that to a little bit about what Mahnaz and Ashley were talking about in terms of the star considerations, and even Shelley, when she was talking about like the romance example, right? Like here's a trope, or a plot structure we've seen maybe ad nauseum, but with only white characters or only cisgender heteronormative characters. And this is the first time we're seeing it with a different sort of representation, or through a different lens, or a subject through a different lens that's more diverse and inclusive and authentic. That absolutely can make a star. We're looking for that representation that's so needed. So it is a huge factor in the way that anything else, literary merit, appeal, artistic, like it has equal weight as far as I'm concerned when you're weighing all of those different factors around a book, for sure.
I concur. And I think it's also important to note that, like, I feel like it's also sort of woven into all those things too. It's hard to sort of separate it out. And I think it is really crucial to be thinking about it at every stage, like there's the stage of, do I start this, yes or no, but also there's the kind of broader stage when we think about like what kind of editorial coverage are we doing in terms of book lists and so forth, or when we do our best books list, like we're never going to have a we have separate book lists for YA, for middle grade, for graphic novels. No single list could just be an all white, cisgender list. That would be, we're not serving our audiences in the right way if we do that. So that's something that we're always thinking about. So, because we're thinking about diversity of publishers, we want diversity of genres on each best list, but we also want diversity of identity in terms of race, in terms of sexuality, because we want books where, all kids can really see themselves. And I think that, just it kind of weaves into it. It's not like at the end where you're like, well, let's check a quota. It's more like as you're doing it, you're considering things, and you're considering things too, I think, like stereotypical or, tropes or that kind of thing as you go. So I think the fact that you want to have it kind of woven into the mindset at each level, which I think also, Kiera was really so instrumental in doing when you were reviews director, really getting us to think about that in an organic way and to think about it at every level.
Yeah. And one of the things that we're trying to do as much as possible and kind of train our reviewers to do as well is to take note. We're trying as best to identify race, ethnicity, ability, gender, religion, all of those things within our reviews, because we're trying to work against that white default. And so you may have noticed that there's been an uptick in that kind of thing. And so that's the major reason behind that. And as Ashley alluded to earlier, we try our best to match reviewers. It's like a matchmaking. We always talk about that. It's like you're a matchmaker. We have this huge Google Doc of every one of our reviewers, their interests, their expertise, and also for those who are comfortable sharing, also any of their identities. And we try our best, if they're okay with it, to then also match a reviewer according to that identity. So it's a complex process, complicated process, and we just want to offer as much as strong evaluation as possible, because we know that you trust us. And that's a huge, huge responsibility that each of us understand and feel every time we edit. So we do have 2 minutes left. Someone was asking about what was the criteria that Kiera mentioned, and that is the ALSC notables criteria. So please, do feel free, do look it up on ALSC. Let me see, what can we get to? Ashley, here's a great question for you from Jamie Shapiro. Oh my God, there we go. How many books does each reviewer review per year? No, that was not the question I was looking at. Sorry. Okay,
I can tell you that varies, and doing chapter books, it's less than if you're doing picture books.
Right.
And then if you get to do a committee, I've been very fortunate to get to do the best of YA committee. That's a whole nother level of reading. So it really varies by reviewer.
Yeah. Another really good question from Jamie. As a reviewer, does your time/work count in regards to professional development credit for librarian certificates? I know each state, country might be different.
Ooh, that's a good question. I've never actually tried to get any type of credit for it. I just like having it. It's something that I can show my principal that I'm doing something professional outside of the school, which I really like. It's something that can go on my resume, and it helps when I'm in Texas. So we're a little challenge happy at the moment. And so it's nice to be one of the people that's making the reviews. So I kind of can speak to that when we have challenges come up, and I can be like, well, I review for SLJ, and we really do look at this criteria to make sure that it's, the right book for the right readers.
Yes, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us in this webcast. It's already 2 o'clock, but like I said, we could talk about this all day. And I did put in the link. If you are interested in reviewing for SLJ, please do reach out. with any questions. We're going to try our best to answer the 36 questions that are left. And I hope you enjoyed this webcast, and it'll be available for at least 3 months, if not more. So thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.
Bye, adios.
Oh my goodness.
Bye, everyone. God